Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another one of our question and answer sessions with our Rosh Bet Midrash, Rabbi Joseph Dweck. A couple of things to announce. Firstly, the New York chapter of the Chabura are beginning their study of Sefer Shmuel Bet. If you are interested in joining, please reach out to the Chabura. Next week on Sunday, we also have a class from Professor Igor de Suiza on the early commentators of the Moreh Nevuchim. So if you are interested, please do join. This is a members-only class. If you are interested in membership, please reach out to the Chabura. And without further ado, we will begin the question and answer. Thank you, Rabbi Dweck.
Thank you very, very much. And good to see everyone. So we've got a good number of questions here. And as usual, there's about two or three that I'm not going to answer on here, but I hope to be able to at least attempt to answer the great majority of them, given our time frame. So I will go maximum till 90 minutes. And then if we don't, there's some that we don't answer here, I'll try to answer in the next one, in the next session that we do. Okay, so I'm going to go in order. Well, we've organized the questions in categories. So I think that I'm going to begin with the halachic oriented questions. The first question comes from Gabriel in Brazil. And the question is, do whey protein supplements require certification? And what about the issues of other ingredients? What about creatine? Gabriel, thank you for your question. I'm glad that you're concerned about your protein, as everybody should be. Look, the answer to this question is the similar answer to kind of any time that people ask the question of do things require certification? The purpose of certification is in order to do the work that we otherwise would not find ourselves equipped to do. And what work is that? That is the work of knowing what it is that what we're eating is comprised of, right? Knowing what the ingredients are and ultimately kind of what's in it. And if there is anything in it that would be unkosher and that we would not be allowed to eat. So does whey protein require certification? Nothing requires certification in the sense of kind of an imperative lehalacha. The reason why certification helps and why we tend to rely on certifications is because we rely on people who we hope are ne'eman, right? We hope are faithful to testify, essentially, to the fact that a particular food is void of problems with regards to kashrut. So if you can read the ingredients of the whey protein that you would like to consume, and you know what those ingredients are, right? You are clear on all of the ingredients and you don't know them to be contaminated in any way from something that the Torah tells us we're not allowed to eat or that the Hachamim would require us not to eat, then you can have that whey protein, right? That's halacha, right? That's the truth. But you need to know what you're reading, right? So you need to know what the ingredients what the ingredients are. And there's a lot of stuff, I would imagine, in the proteins. So you have to just know what it is that's in there. And if you read what's in there and you know what it is and you don't see anything that is apparent to be asur, given that you know what it is that you're reading and you're seeing, you don't have to assume isur is lurking where it's not mentioned. And in that case, you can use that as your principle. Creatine doesn't require, it's just creatine, and you can have that, and that's fine. Okay, next question is another kashrut question that is from Brooklyn, New York. Is it permissible to eat at a vegan restaurant? What halachic concerns might arise, and under what circumstances could leniencies apply? So here, similar, right? Bottom line is you have to know what it is you're eating. With regards to vegan restaurants, even though people might think, look, what could possibly be? A vegan restaurant, it's not meat, it's not dairy, it doesn't come from any animal products, it's natural, ingredients that grow from the ground, vegetables and things like that. What could be the problem? There are problems. even with vegetables. And one of the problems is bishulei goyim. So if we are to hold from bishulei goyim, the gezerah bishulei goyim, there are certain vegetables that we are not allowed to eat because they are both ole al shulchan melachim and they're not nechadim k'mot shem hai, which means that we would not eat them raw, and they would normally be used in a state dinner or in a formal dinner of the highest dignitary of the land, right, or of the king or queen. So, some might say that, eggplant, or what they call here aubergine, for example, right? That could be a serious problem. Why? People don't eat that raw, and it's very likely that that vegetable could be cooked and put into dishes and on the table of very, very high level dinners. So, and this is an example, right? I can understand why people might argue with that, but nonetheless, just because it is not of animal product, it doesn't mean that there's not any sur for us to eat it for other reasons. So that's one thing. The other thing is wine, right? Wine is vegan, and it's possible to be used in ingredients, and it may not be wine that is allowed. So those are things, for example, that a person has to be concerned with. And then overall, you just have to be concerned about the fact that you are relying on what it is that you're told in these restaurants, and that's an issue of ne'emanut, of trustworthiness. So all of those things are concerns, and those are things that you really have to know. What it is that you're doing, and what you're having, and what's in what you're eating, and those kinds of things. And that's why one must be very, very careful with those kinds of things. And sometimes people don't have the capacity to be careful because of a lack of scholarship. So that is my answer to that. And the next question is a question on the nature of humrot from Lionel in Los Angeles. Lionel has sent several questions here, but this is the following. What is the proper purpose for a person to take on a halachic stringency? How do the concepts of halachic stringencies and lifnim mishurat adin, going beyond the letter of the law, as he translates, relate? That's a good question, right? What are the criteria that a person should take on a stringency? The first thing is that it's not necessarily a good thing for a person to look for stringencies to take on. The, what's the word? I would say the best guidance that I would suggest in terms of entertaining a stringency should more often than not be a concern of transgression, right? So if you're concerned for whatever reason personally that you might miss something, you might transgress something, you might miss a mitzvah aseh, or you might cross and transgress a mitzvah lo ta'aseh, both the rabbanan mitzvah aseh lo ta'aseh deoraita, or any of the requirements of the hakamim, and you recognize that you might struggle with that, or you might in yourself, not just because of willpower, you might just find yourself in a situation where it's very iffy as to whether you're in the clear in terms of what it is that you're doing. In those situations, it's praiseworthy, it's a good idea for an individual to be able to be stringent, to be a bit more mahmir. And that's really the point, right? That's what it is. And even the Ramchal in the Mesilat Yesharim, he talks about this when he presents it. It's all in order to clear the danger of inadvertently falling into Isur, either by not doing something that is a positive, a requirement, both Deoraita and Rabbanan, or by potentially crossing or transgressing something, right? So, and a good example might be a vegan restaurant, right? So even if a person's completely clear on the fact that, I know whether this is bishulei goyim or not, I know that there's no wine, I know that there's no, bugs in my vegetables or whatever the case may be. But to say that one can be fully clear from the line, right, of what it is that a person is running very, very close to is not so easy, even for the greatest hacham in a situation like that. And that might be a pleasure. He says, something, I'm not eating in a restaurant that I don't know is kasher and has a kasher and so on and so forth. That's an acceptable, accept in my opinion, right? That's an acceptable humrah. It's an understandable humrah, and it's something that is okay for a person to do. On this, question, I'm going to bring the next question. This is from Abi in Brooklyn, also had many questions in this particular grouping. He asks, can one just accept any humrah? No, a person cannot just accept any humrah. A person has to be, both Lionel's question and Abi's question is important to recognize. And this is something that people don't recognize at all, usually, right? They believe that humrot are always okay. It's just a question of whether I feel like taking it or not, or whether I feel I need to take it or not. And that's not true, right? Just as the Torah has told us that we are not allowed to do things, and we're not allowed to do the things that the Torah tells us that we shouldn't do, so too when the Torah says this is mutar, this is allowed for you, we have to be very careful about saying, I'm saying it's asur, even if we do it in the guise of a humrah. And we say that on Yom Kippur all the time, right? We say it's one of the elements of the vidui of Yom Kippur. Asher asarta hetarti, right? Which you prohibited, I allowed. Asher hetarta esarti, and what you allowed, I prohibited. That's both. So just as problematic as it is to go against what the Torah says not to do, it's problematic to not allow yourself to do what the Torah says to you to do. And that's something the Hachamim say as well. Lo dai lecha ma she'asra Torah. Rambam quotes that when he writes about the Nazir in Hilchot, in Halachot, right? That it's really, he mentions it in Hilchot Derot. He says that a person should be careful not to restrict things that are not restricted onto him. Just as the Nazir, all he restricted upon himself was wine, and that was done because he was fulfilling the mitzvah of Nazir of the Torah, and yet it required him to remove himself from drinking wine, and he has to bring a hatat over that. That's how Rambam interprets it, based on the Hachamim. So all the more so a person who is osir other things on themselves. So you have to be very, very careful about these kinds of humrah. It is good to do a humrah where you are worried that you are going to transgress or miss a positive. And that's fine. And that's why I always love the language, Hacham Adlum Abadi, in Sefer Magen Ba'adi. He has the teshubah about dishwashers, whether you're allowed to use the dishwasher for meat and milk at the same time. And I believe that I actually taught that teshubah in the Habura some eons ago. So I encourage you to dig that up and find it. But he writes a wonderful line in there. And he says that because he concludes that it is permitted to use the dishwasher for meat and milk at the same time, right? So you can put meat dishes and milk dishes in the dishwasher at the same time. And then he says, and if you want to use it separately, do it milk separately and meat separately, dairy and meat dishes separately, mutar le'ahmir. He says it's permitted to be mahmir, right? Which is a phenomenal point, but of course a beautiful one, right? I mean, when's the last time you heard a hacham say mutar le'ahmir? So he said, in that case, it's a humrah that's acceptable, right? It's a humrah that is allowed for a person to take. So we have to be very careful about those kinds of things. And if you're questioning, you should speak to a hacham who knows these things, right? And can help you think through whether it's appropriate or not appropriate. This question is also from AB. If commerce is allowed on Shabbat for a mitzvah, why is pidyon haben, or pidyon, I suppose you mean the plural of pidyon haben, not performed? Good question, right? So an example, so the Hachamim are, first of all, it's important to recognize that what we call mekah hamimkar or masal matan, right? What we would roughly term as business transactions or financial transactions, or like you're saying, commerce, is a rabbinic prohibition. So the Torah does not prohibit this. The Hachamim prohibit this, right? They prohibit it because they're worried about people writing, they're worried about all kinds of other things, isurim that are isurim de oraita, that people may come to do on Shabbat, not to mention the very mundane nature of it, right? And what that creates for Shabbat. And so since the Hachamim prohibited it, the Hachamim allowed for it in areas of mitzvah. Pidyon haben is a little bit different. And the reason for that is because even in the areas where the Hachamim allowed it, they did not allow a person, for example, to actually carry money and pay money on Shabbat. They allowed for certain transactional activities that did not require holding money, right? And actually paying money, physical cash. And the Pidyon haben requires that, right? The Pidyon haben requires kesef. And you have to give this over to the Kohen as the act of Pidyon. So that is not permitted. And the same, and also in addition to that, you can do the pidyon after the 30th day, right? It's just that you can't do it before the 30th day, but after the 30th day, it's still permitted to do. And so they didn't want to allow for that on Shabbat. The next question is from Miami, Florida. Is the knowledge that stainless steel is non-porous enough to allow us to use it both for dairy and meat, or do we need a Sanhedrin to reestablish and allow us to do so? The answer to that is very simple. No, we don't need a Sanhedrin to reestablish that because it's not something that the Sanhedrin prohibited. There was no stainless steel in the time of the Talmud, right? And the reasons for what they call metals as being problematic are not gizerot, right? It's not a gizerah of the Hakamim. It's not something that they establish and require. It was just a technical reality, right? So the majority of what it was that what they had as metal in those times is very much like cast iron, which is tremendously porous and definitely does absorb the taste of what was cooked in it before, and it's a very big problem. They had glass in their time, and they recognized that glass is not it doesn't absorb, and therefore cannot put anything out in terms of taste, and therefore didn't recognize that there was a need for separate things. So I would say that technically speaking, no, of course we don't need, and I do believe that stainless steel doesn't absorb, and Alav Shalom Dayan Amor, who was the Rosh Bet Din of my Bet Din when I arrived, tremendous Hatani Hakam agreed that stainless steel does not absorb. It is a minhag not to use it that way. All right, it's a minhag to maintain two sets of metal cutlery and pots and pans and things of that nature. And that is more a question of like, are we breaching minhag and should we breach this minhag and what is the fallout of breaching this minhag and so on, which I don't want to get into. However, I will say that because I do believe very strongly that stainless steel does not absorb, it is a snif lekula, right? It's an aspect lekula that I will include many times when people ask me halachot with regards to these things. Wearing a kippah. This is from Jeff Sakal in Brooklyn. Hope you are well. Good to hear from you. Is it mandatory to wear a kippah to pray or to talk to Hashem? If yes, can you cover your head with a hand or clothing prior to making a prayer? So, a good question. The answer to that is it is not mandatory. It's not mandatory. Maran, Rabbeinu Yosef Karo, posek in Shulchan Aruch, that when you say Hakadosh Baruch Hu's name, your head should be covered. Your head must be covered. That's based on the Rosh, Rabbeinu Ashir. He's posek that way. And so based on the Pesach Din of the Shulchan Aruch, it is mandatory when you say Hakadosh Baruch Hu's name. But it is not mandatory in other times, right? So normally when you're praying, you're saying Hakadosh Baruch Hu's name, so it's appropriate to pray with a head covering. But if you just want to talk to God, per se, is it appropriate? Yes, but you're not asking that. You're asking, is it mandatory? It's not mandatory, but it is appropriate when you're engaged in tefillah, or you might be saying the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of God, to cover your head. And that's based on the Pesach Din of the Shulchan Aruch. But otherwise, it is an appropriate thing to do. It's a praiseworthy thing to do, and it became minhag Israel to do so. The following question is from Miami, Florida again. Wearing techelet. What is the Rav's view on wearing techelet? I mentioned me. My view on wearing techelet is that I encourage people to do that, and I think that it's a very, very positive thing to do. And the reason why I'm saying it in terms of my view, as opposed to the view of the Torah itself, which clearly says, petil techelet, that you have to have techelet on the sisit, is because there is question as to whether what we know as techelet is indeed valid techelet. And this is I don't know if it's complex, but it's an involved halachic issue, because the majority of Rishonim, including Harambam, from the Peshat of Harambam says that the techelet is this blue dye that comes from the hilazon, right? It comes from a specific mollusk. The majority of the Rishonim require that this dye or this color comes from a specific source, which we know to be a mollusk. not everybody agrees to that, right? Some poskim say it just needs to be blue, right? It just needs to be the right color blue, however it is that you get it, and as long as it is color fast, right? As long as it doesn't fade and it doesn't easily wash out and so on and so forth. Um, so my view on it is that we lose nothing to put Techeret on the tzitzit as we have it nowadays, right? Right. First of all, I think that the evidence for the chilazon being what we consider to be what it is the trunculus. I remember the exact technical term for the mollusk. Um, First of all, I think it's very, very good evidence, right? The murex. Thank you. I think that it's very good evidence, and it's enough for me, right? So, but even if it is not it, um, we lose nothing to put a string of blue onto our sisit because there's nothing that prohibits us from coloring the tzitzit, right? There's a halakha in Shulchan Aruch that says that if you wear your tzitzit should match whatever color garment you wear. Right? It's not a requirement. It's a shebach, right? It's a hidur, but there's nothing wrong with coloring the tzitzit. Yeah, it doesn't say anywhere the tzitzit need to be white. So I lose nothing by coloring it, and I gain the mitzvah if it is indeed the appropriate techelet. So that add to that I think that the evidence is very, very strong that it is indeed the appropriate source for those who require that to be the source. I'm all for it. So I have techelet pretty much on all of my telitot that I wear. But I don't think that a person who doesn't do it is wrong, or they're doing something inappropriate. I just think that it is a good thing to do, so I do it. Okay, the following questions are within the realm of kind of halachic frame and structure and philosophy, essentially. So this question is from Daniel Crespin. And he asks, why does halakha insist on treating converts as lower than regular Jews? First of all, I don't think that's true. I think that that's an assumption. It does not insist on treating converts as lower than regular Jews. To the contrary, it tells us that we have to love them, like you say. Despite the Torah repeatedly telling us to love the convert and treat them like a native. What you do single out here is that it prohibits them from holding positions of authority, which is true. And there is also prohibitions in terms of Kohanim marrying converts. There are absolutely restrictions on those who marry into or come into the nation of Israel legally, as to the degree to which we recognize them as as a member of the people. All of that essentially has to do with pedigree, not with status amongst the people. And it's important to recognize that Torah definitely holds value in terms of pedigree overall, right? In other words, there are certain things that the Torah recognizes as having to do with lineage and familial connections. And so when it comes to leadership, it learns all of the leadership law, at least the way that we have it now, from the Torah statements on kings. And it says me'achecha, right? It says that you have to have somebody from your brethren. And the Hachamim just clearly learn me'achecha as those who are born as members of Israel, not those who came in as converts to Israel. That's all. It's a pedigree question. And same thing with regards to the Kohanim. Right? So it's not a question of having lower status. It's a question of what line do they come from? And that's just something that when it's an issue of pedigree, the ger is not recognized as an acceptable option. There's members of Israel that are not recognized as acceptable options in terms of pedigree as well, right? But when it comes to Talmud Torah and the like, I mean, that's the great equalizer. And the fact that they are part of members of Israel and they require our love and their special mitzvot for their love does not budge, right? I mean, that remains the same. So I think it's important to recognize the difference between the two. The following question is also a question from Daniel Crespin, New York City. The Exodus story shows God despises slavery. I disagree. I don't think that the Exodus story shows that God despises slavery at all. Cecil B. DeMille believed that that's what the story showed. What it shows is that God didn't want Am Yisrael to be under the enslavement of Paro. That's what it says. That's what it shows. And that's all it shows. I don't think it shows anything other than that. And not only that, notice that not once in the entire story of the Yetziat Mitzrayim and Shemot and the whole thing does it use the word freedom. It never talks about freedom at all. As a matter of fact, what it says is you are to set the people, let the people go, right? Paroz to let the people go. Why? Ki avadaihim v'ya'avduni. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I want them to serve me, not you. So, that's what it shows. But nonetheless, you ask, the Gemara refers to all non-Jewish slaves. It prohibits freeing them. It says, "Le'olam bahem ta'abodu," right? That's how they understand that pasuk. And the reason for that Hachamim see that appropriately Gentile slaves should not be freed by Israel is because and this is not politically correct in any way, right? But nonetheless, in the frame that it is presented, it sees the slavery to Am Yisrael, right? In other words, being enslaved to people that are members of Am Yisrael better for the individual because they are closer to Torah, they are closer to the Am in the Berit, and they are very intimately connected to the people. And that is better for them than simply being free agents in the world as Ovdei Avodah Zarah and on their own. That's really what it is in the essence, right? Now, of course, people could get very, very, radically up in arms as a result of that because it's very crass to modern ears, but you can understand the frame that the Hachamim see it in and see them as being tremendously in better state as a result of that. Okay. The next question is from Lionel again. Why do Hazal think non-Jews shouldn't study Torah? They don't say this anywhere. Hachamim do not. I just gave a shiur on this in the Tishu B'Av Harambam. Hachamim do not say that they should not study Torah. It says that the words of Torah should not be delivered to them, which is very specific. Lo yimasiru, which Harambam is not posek, incidentally. And it says that they themselves are not to be osek b'Torah, right? That they are not to toil or work in Torah as though it belongs to them, because it's ours. It belongs to us. It's our covenant. And they have to be able to know it in terms of the frame that we received it. So there's nothing wrong with teaching them if they will be able to receive it in the frame that we have it. But to take the Torah and be megale panim b'Torah shelo kehalacha, right? To basically interpret Torah in foreign terms is terribly problematic in of itself, A, and B, for the non-Jews to take what is the source of our covenant and make it theirs as though it belongs to them or they feel like just taking it, that's essentially a form of theft. And that the Torah does not see as a positive. And this question is from Moshe from Muncie. What is the meaning of halacha le Moshe misinai? Should it be taken literally? How is it different from the Mesorah of interpretation? An eye for an eye, meaning monetary compensation. Okay. Halacha le Moshe misinai is a technical legal term. And it means something very specific. Rambam writes in the opening of the Perush Mishnah that the term of Halakha Moshe Sinai refers to details of law that have no source in the text. That's what Halakha Moshe, and that there's no dispute on these things, right? So, for example, it says that all of the measurements right? Tefah and Ama and and log and all of these whatever riv'it, these things that we use as measurements and how what things need to measure. That's not mentioned in Torah, right? That you have to eat a kazait, right? Or that you have to, you have to eat a kotebet to be hayav for eating on Kippur and all of these kinds of things. Those things are halakha Moshe Sinai. Those things are things that have no mention in the text directly, that there's no dispute on, and that we recognize it as a Mesorah, right? That it's coming all the way from Moshe all the way down to us. Um, that's what it is. Okay. Okay, so let's go to switch gears a little bit and look at some theological and philosophical questions. Back to Lionel in Los Angeles. And his question is, do you think observing mitzvot purely for social reasons or as, quote, what Jews do, unquote, without firm commitment to traditional theology, brackets divine revelation, is a viable basis for Judaism? Or is firm theological commitment necessary alongside practice? It's a good question. I don't think it's a viable basis for Judaism at all, because the entirety of Judaism is based on the berit between Am Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and nothing else. So whatever it is outside of that, or whatever people might be doing outside of that, is a mimicry of what we would call, for lack of a better term, Judaism, but is not Judaism. Anything that is not within the frame of berit between Am Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the endeavor to fulfill that berit is not Judaism. So people can be doing the exact same behaviors as a mitzvah and be using the same language and the same actions and still not be the thing. That's absolutely can happen. It does happen. Now, do I think that people should be discouraged from performing mitzvot for social reasons? Not necessarily. So there's two things you ask, right? You ask, is it viable? Well, maybe you don't ask two things. I'm responding to two things. I don't think it's viable as a basis for Judaism, which is what your question was. No, Judaism would fall apart if that was the only thing that people did. The question is, should people be discouraged from doing this? And I would advise against discouraging people from doing this, because it can nonetheless act as, I'm going to use some funny words here, as a repository for the spores of Israel that otherwise would blow into the wind and be lost. Another way of saying that is it acts as a binding agent. So in terms of kind of technical, mechanical terms, it could be helpful, right? It's better that they do these practices and identify with the people in their practices than not. Because if they don't, they will be, again, floating in the wind, right? And without root. So I would not discourage the behavior. But your question was, is it a viable basis for Judaism? It is not a viable basis for Judaism. And I explained why. Next question, also from Lionel. How do you understand the passages in the Torah that convey the idea that keeping the mitzvot leads to material prosperity, while failing to observe them will lead to severe punishment in this world? Um, I don't understand anything. Harambam writes about this explicitly. So I refer you to the 9th chapter of Hilchot Teshuvah. And I think that Harambam will answer your question. And if there's anything left there that he has not answered, please write back. The next question is from Alex Zemel in Tel Aviv. Hello, Alex. Given the Rambam's view that Hashgacha Piratit, that direct or individualized divine providence, increases with one's intellectual or spiritual development, what is the nature and extent of divine involvement in the lives of those who have not reached that level? Thank you for the question. I'm not sure I understand the question because when you say not reached that level, which level is that? I don't I don't identify a particular level here. It is true that Harambam says that Hashgaha Piratit increases with one's conscious connection, right? To HaKadosh Baruch. So there's a spectrum with regards to that. And it depends on where a person's conscious awareness is. So there is a certain basic hashgaha that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has for Kalal Yisrael simply as a result of the berit of Abraham Abinu and the berit of Har Sinai. It's just there, right? It starts, you come out of the box. It's the what do you call it? The factory conditions, the factory settings that a member of Am Yisrael has. Beyond that is a question of how you wish to build the relationship. So that all depends on your conscious intent and intentional investment in the relationship. It's like any other relationship. So I would take that and use that as a frame. There's no that level, right? There are levels upon levels upon levels, and there are various modes of and intensities of relationship. And Hakadosh Baruch Hu could be manifest with a person on any number of levels. Can be manifest with the same person on any number of levels, depending on what's going on in the relationship at the time. This is from Saul in Brooklyn. Do you think the world truly operates in a Malthusian way? No, I don't. But I don't know what you meant particularly by that. I mean, the Malthusian theory is very specific, right? Where scarcity, you say where scarcity, conflict, correction are built into creation in order to be able to correct for things and war and things like that. Or is what looks like randomness and struggle part of a larger divine plan? So that's a very large question, Saul, because basically you're asking why evil? And I can give you a very, very broad and basic answer to that, but it won't satisfy you, I think. Um, so all that I can say to that is it's important to understand that whatever it is that we see as being evil is a result of the lack of Hakadosh Baruch Hu's presence, right? And actually, I should correct that. I'm sorry. I'm going to correct that. It's not what we see as being evil. What we see as being negative, right? Evil, more likely than not, requires malintent. Yeah, it requires malintent in order for it to be evil, and it requires us to determine it as such. But for things to be negative, for things to suffer, as you say, right? Or things to corrode, for things to fall apart and all of that, right? So yeah, the Malthusian theory is that these are necessary in order to be able to maintain the viability of the planet. And there is some truth to that, of course. But I think it goes beyond that, right? It's a question of the void of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to whatever degree it is void, in the world. And when that void is manifest, there is, we're dealing with a random world and random developments, and there's any number of things that can happen in a random world. The question, of course, is why? Why should there be that? And that's a deeper question, which it requires its own treatment that it goes beyond the scope of the question answer session now, but I actually gave a two-part shiur on this, which unfortunately is unavailable because my app is down. But and by the way, I will say, as we've got people here and anybody will hear that who are listening to this, we need to get the app back up, and I am struggling to find a clear path forward with regards to that. So if you have ideas onto who would be great at doing this and would be able to streamline it and get it done in a very quick way, uh, get in touch with me. Next question is from Yaakov Baredis in Brooklyn, New York. What is this must be a typo. It says Hanhara here, but I'm imagining Harambam, right? What is I'm imagining you're saying, I think, overall view on the afterlife. And if you're not, I apologize because I'm answering it as though you said Harambam. So what is Harambam's overall view on the afterlife? I'm looking for more clarity on Olam Haba, Olam Ha'emet, Gan Eden, Ginnam, Tehiyat HaMetim, Mashiach, Gog uMagog. Well, good for you, Yaakov. I would say, I would refer you to, first of all, have a look at the eighth chapter of Hilchot Teshuvah, in which Harambam discusses Olam Haba. I would also refer you to the Harambam's Hakdama to Perek Helek, which is the 10th chapter of Masechet Sanhedrin, the Mishnah, in which he discusses this in greater length. And he also talks about how valuable it is to pay attention and to really invest a lot of time in studying all of these things. So I encourage you to have a look there. And that's L'Haraba. Okay. This is from Felix in New York. Hello, Felix. What exactly is the quote pleasing odor God smelled after Noah's offering? What changed in that moment for God and for humanity? And what does the idea of bringing Qurban really mean? And how does that relate to us today? Okay, it's funny because people ask as though they're asking a question and then put 10 questions into one question. But nonetheless, I will answer the first and say that's clearly a borrowed term, Felix, right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not have nostrils or olfactory nerves. He's not smelling anything. What it's saying is that Noah's offering, right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu is speaking to us in human terms, saying it was as though the smell, the scent of the offering was favorable. It was found favor with Hakadosh Baruch Hu, right? And that's all it means. That's all it means. You don't have to get tangled up in the how did he smell stuff, right? He doesn't smell anything. It's speaking about it in relatable terms. What would it be like if Hakadosh Baruch Hu actually smelled it and it was right? It's another way of saying, it's a poetic way of saying that it found favor with Hakadosh Baruch Hu. And what changed was that there was an overture by humanity towards God, a huge overture. And that brought them close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's what it means. And when you come close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's a serious thing. That's a serious thing. That's the same thing that a Korban does. That's why Korban is called a Korban. Again, you bring it close. Lehakriv, right? Lehakriv means to bring it close, to come towards. Karev elai, right? Karev means come close to me, come towards me. And that's exactly what you're doing. You're bringing your mind, your actions towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's what it is. And whenever you lean towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you turn your mind and your actions towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you stand before him. So that's the basic answer. I gave a 10-part series on the nature of Hashgacha and why this is the case and how that works, which I will do again. I did that when I was in Deal, but I didn't put it out. I didn't put out the recordings, but I'm going to be doing this for the LSJS. So stay tuned. So anybody who's on my WhatsApp groups will definitely get notification when this starts. And I'm giving the initial lecture in a few weeks' time at the LSJS. So stay tuned on my WhatsApp groups. Everything will be on the WhatsApp groups. And if you're not on WhatsApp groups, I encourage you to get on them because that's where you find whatever it is that I'm doing. All righty. This question is from Sarit Goldberg, UK. Moshe was an Avi. That is true. That is true, Sarit. Did he know he came for the mission to do a tikkun as the Gilgul of Noah? Well, Sarit, there's a lot of assumption in your question. There's a lot of assumption in your question. It is true that Rabbeinu Ha'ari writes that Moshe Rabbeinu was a Gilgul of Noah, and that when Moshe asked HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he said to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ata Amarta, Rabbeinu Shalom, you said, Yida'aticha b'shem, v'gam asata hen be'enai. Right, when he's praying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu on behalf of the people for the Egel HaZahav, he says, you said that you know me by name and that I have found favor in your eyes. And Rabbeinu Ari points out, Lo ra'inu b'chol Torah, we saw, I didn't say anywhere in the whole Torah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe Rabbeinu, Matzata hen be'enai. So he says that's by Noah. That says, V'Noach masah hen be'enai Adonai. Right? And that's Moshe in the Teba, right? Because he was put in a Teba when he was a baby, right? And he was sent on into the water and all of that. So look, I explained the concept of Gilgul, if I'm not mistaken, in a previous Q&A. I don't remember which Q&A it is, but it's in a previous Q&A. And I explained the whole nature of that. So if you listen to that, you'll have a better sense of what Rabbeinu Ari means when he says what it is that he says about Moshe. Okay? And in that capacity, I suppose you could say that Moshe Rabbeinu had a sense of the continuity of what was happening in the world, starting from Noah and coming through whatever it was that Moshe was doing. I would suspect so. Okay, the next question is as follows. When I pause and suddenly decide, from the United States, which is a big place, but thank you for asking the question. When I pause and suddenly become aware that God exists and created the universe, is there anything more for me to do at that point, or do I just end up getting back into my work? Well, first of all, I will say if you have to ask that, then there's something about it sounds very, very detached and intellectual, right? As opposed to, experiencing God and knowing God. But I would imagine if you have come to that reality, you serve him and you strive to know him. And that is what your life is about in toto. That's what you should do. And aim your entire life towards those aims. Next question is from Aaron Coleman in Manchester. Hello, Aaron. Good to hear from you. How does one balance the act of pushing oneself to overcome a struggle or obstacle versus accepting and submitting oneself to God's will, especially in gray areas like communal activities or projects? When is a struggle a pathway to growth, and when is it a message from God to step down, which could also be a passage to growth, right? So it sounds to me like you are asking. There are also assumptions here in this question. It's wonderful, right, to have a stream of questions because it's very, very interesting to hear the questioner's thought in the question. What you're saying is that there's a difference between pushing oneself and overcoming a struggle or submitting oneself to God's will, as though they are opposing elements. One should never not submit oneself to God's will. Everything you do should be submitting yourself to God's will. What you might mean, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, what you might mean is when do you surrender and no longer act in the endeavor? And that is a good question, and that is what may be spoken about in the rabbinic vernacular as hishtadlut, right? What do you do in terms of your own actions in order to be able to do what you need to do? Or as the pasuk says in Mishle, sus muchan leyom milchama veladonai hayshoah, right? Make sure that your horse is ready for the day of war, but salvation is in the hand of God. Yeah, all of those things. Yeah, all those things. So what I will say with regards to hishtadlut is this. It is all a question of control. And I'm sure that people have heard me speak about this before. I've spoken about it many times before, but it's always worth repeating. And that is, it is all a question of control. And in any given situation, you need to do a deep search, right? You need to do a deep contemplation in your truest self and consider what you can and cannot control in any given situation. And a great many times we mistake and we think that we can control things that we cannot, and we think that we cannot control things that we indeed can. And we mess things up because of that all the time. So the first thing that is important to do is to determine the difference. Determine what in any given situation can you genuinely control. And if you can genuinely control what is going on, well, then by all means do. And do it in the best possible way that you can. Dedicated to serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Do you hear? That's number one. When you recognize that you cannot control the situation, an example of this is if another person is involved. We can't control other people. We can barely control ourselves, much less other people. So when there's another person involved and it requires you controlling that other person, you are not in control. You may think you're in control, you may try to be manipulative and coercive and whatever the case may be. 9 times out of 10, you're transgressing a mitzvah in whatever it is you're doing to try and manipulate this person and coerce this person. It doesn't work. It's just an example. You need to determine what you no longer can control or what you are not weren't able in the beginning to control. But when you know that you cannot control something, you have no other choice but to submit it to one who can. And the majority of times, the one who can is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and you give that to him. And that's it. When it's your plumbing, you give it to the plumber, but otherwise you give it to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So when you are saying, how do I know if I'm overcoming a struggle versus accepting and submitting oneself to God's will? It's always God's will. Then the question with regards to the struggle is, well, what do you have it in you? Do you have it in you in order to be able to overcome it or not? And when you do overcome it, where will you be? Will you be better for overcoming it? Or will you find yourself in a position that is just as bad as it was in the beginning? These are important things to be able to consider, right? But ultimately, it all has to be a question of what it is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu desires of me, and that's something that we dedicate ourselves to trying to understand. But more often than not, it's a question of what it is that I can and cannot control, and to be able to come to the clarity of that. I hope that that helps. You may feel that I've completely missed your point, but if so, try again. I'm always happy to revisit. Okay, carrying on. Another question from Daniel Crispin, and this has to do with Misorah and things of that nature, and frame of law. Rambam explains in Hilchot Mamrin that Mahloket emerged in Israel because of the loss of the Bet Din Gadol. However, the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah implies that the Sanhedrin Bet Din Gadol existed beyond the doesn't more than implies, existed beyond the destruction of the temple and through the days of the Tanaim. Since disputes among the Tanaim still occurred, how is one to understand Rambam's position? Good question, Daniel. When Harambam talks about mahloket and says that when the Sanhedrin was around, there was no mahloket, he's not saying that there were not differences of opinion. Of course, there were differences of opinion. There were always differences of opinion. Do you think that the Hachamei Sanhedrin, that the Dayanim of the Sanhedrin didn't argue? That they didn't have mahloket? Of course, they had mahloket. And all of the mahlokot that you see in the Mishnah are those kinds of mahlokot. The question is not whether there was mahloket or not. The question is, what do we do? That was the question. And when Harambam says that there was no mahloket, what he's saying is it did not end in mahloket. There could be a myriad of opinions, but what we do was determined by the Sanhedrin. That's what he's saying. Today, where there's no Sanhedrin, there is a myriad of opinions, and these opinions are asserting that you should do what they say. And we've got a myriad of opinions that we have to choose how it is that we're supposed to behave based on what it is that they are telling us that we should do that are oftentimes diametrically opposed. That's the problem. So it's not an issue that the fact that there is mahlokot in the Mishnah or the Talmud for that matter. Because there was an assertion that ultimately was posek, which literally means cut, shut it down, and said ultimately this is halacha. We do not have that anymore today. That's what Harambam is saying. Next question is from Ephraim from Hollywood, Florida. Rambam gives the Talmud the authority of a Sanhedrin because, quote, it was accepted by all of Kilal Yisrael. How can this be said as of its redaction, 400 CE, circa 400 CE, when there were established communities in places far from Babylonia, for example, Italy and Spain? Thank you, Ephraim. First of all, Harambam says more than that. He says more than it was accepted by all of Kilal Yisrael. He says two things. He says it was accepted by all of Kilal Yisrael, and he says that it was established and agreed upon by Kol Hachmei Yisrael or Rubam, right? Either the majority, all of the Hachamim, or at least the great majority of the Hachamim, right? So the same is true with regards to what he says with regards to Kelal Israel, right? So first of all, there's two components, right? There's the Hachamim that are establishing, and there's the acceptance of Kelal Israel that render it as binding, right? Also, I would take issue with the fact that Rambam gives Talmud the authority of a Sanhedrin. Not quite, right? He's establishing here something specific, right, that is unique. But nonetheless, the community at the time that you're talking about, right? The communities in Italy and the communities in Spain, and there were communities elsewhere, right? That wasn't the only place that there were satellite communities, but that is exactly what they were, satellites. Babel was the hub. It was the sun around which every satellite community revolved. It's important to recognize. And when they had questions about what is it you do, guess where they sent their questions to? Babel. So it's true that there were kind of people scattered around, but they recognized Babel as being the authority. And they continued to send their questions to the Babel for years and years, right? Even after the unofficial close of the Talmud. Yeah. Babel was seen as the establishment. And so what came from there essentially was accepted by all of Kelal Israel. Okay. Moving along to quite a different, bit of a different shade here, a single question on the Mesilat Yesharim, and specifically the dialogue version of Mesilat Yesharim, also by Felix. In Mesilat Yesharim's dialogue, is Ramchal siding with the Hasid over the Hacham or inviting an integration of the two? The Hasid is an integration of the two, right? The Hasid does not know Chokhmah, right? He does not, it's not that he negates Chokhmah. He's presenting the way in which Chokhmah should be studied. And in what terms and in what goals, right? But he is definitely setting the Hasid as the aim and faulting the Chacham. Although he does it brilliantly, because the beginning of the opening, he sets the Chacham as the hero of the story, and then suddenly in one line the tables turn, and suddenly the Hasid is the one who kind of takes the reins. Okay, there's a few questions here about personal and interpersonal relationships. Seems like more about dating and marriage. This is from Brooklyn. When considering a future wife, how important is it to try and find someone with a similar hashkafa to my own? Or is it more important to be compatible with the person, even if on a different level of observance or religion, with the hope that we will end up thinking similarly in the future? That's a good question, and it's not a rare question. Things like this come up all the time. I'm going to give you a klal with regards to this. And this is my own personal belief and approach. But because you're asking me, I'm giving it to you. There is always a bridge, right? I should say it this way. There is always a gap that needs to be bridged between two people who get married. Okay. Every single human being is a profoundly complex organism. Complex psychologically, complex biologically, they're just complex. And because of that complexity, we ourselves find ourselves at odds with ourselves, because there are parts to us that don't always integrate easily. When you choose to marry someone and live your life and try and integrate with someone, you are then doing that squared, right? So it's not just you have to deal with your own complexities and inconsistencies and whatever's. You have to then mesh this with another complex human being that deals with the same complexities and problems of integration in themselves. It is a profoundly fraught endeavor. I heard one person say, this is the reason why you have to be misameach hatan v'chala, because they're miserable. So you have to do your best to be able to make them happy, because this is a tremendously difficult endeavor. Yeah. Okay, maybe tongue in cheek, but nonetheless, it's not easy. That being the case, the gap between two people when they marry is best to be as short as possible. Yeah. So that the bridge doesn't have to traverse a large gap. The less you have to bridge, the better. The less you have to bridge, the better. So if there is a tremendous discrepancy in worldview and religious outlook, it is a tremendous burden on the marriage. And if you don't feel it at the beginnings of the marriage, it will manifest later in the marriage. And there will be greater weights upon it because children will only make that more heavy, not less heavy, because you won't have to be worrying about you, each other, and how you run in the world. You will then have to determine how are you going to raise your children in the world and which worldview and religious outlook is going to be the predominant one, or what kind of meshing are you going to do, and what kind of, and so on and so forth. It is extremely difficult. And the connecting of two people in marriage is fraught enough as it is out of the gate, even if there is very little to bridge. So to make that bridge larger is only inviting greater difficulty. So I advise against it. I'm not saying that it's impossible. I'm not saying that people shouldn't do it ever. I'm saying that it is not on a principle level, it's not a good idea. Do you believe there are telltale signs that you're with the right person? If so, what are they? Well, I mean, that's essentially the opposite of that. First of all, I mean, there should be some sense of attraction, right? And I don't just mean physical attraction. There's what we might call in our vernacular chemistry. There really should be some of that. Now, if there's a lot of that, that could be deceiving. Because if there's a great deal of chemistry, but not a great deal of mutual worldview, mutual philosophy, mutual aims in life, mutual destinies and goals of destination in life, that's problematic. And it's one of the reasons why, for much, much longer in human history than not, people did not marry for love. That's a very Western, very recent, modern, romantic development. They married on compatibility. More often than not, they didn't marry against their will, but they didn't marry out of love. They married for compatibility. It's one of the reasons why they would do what they call, their families would suggest who would be right for them. And that's not crazy at all. Not at all. Right? I'm not saying that it was a fail safe and that nothing ever, nothing bad or problematic ever happened as a result of that, but there's a reason why it happened for a very, very, very long time, right? So the signs of the right person are compatibility and mutual aims and goals. When I say compatibility, I don't mean homogeneity. I don't mean that they need to be the same as you, right? Very often, people who marry are quite different in their personalities, but they complement each other in their personalities. But more important than that is that they agree on the big things. They agree on the kind of household they want to create. They agree on the kind of children that they want to raise. They agree on the aims of their lives and what they consider their high values. That's important. And if those things are not there and you're not talking about those things and all you're feeling is head over heels in love with somebody, that's terribly deceptive. Because as exciting and wonderful and elating as it is to be in love with somebody, that fades after about 2 years or so. And when that fades, because it's a biological trick, right? But when that does fade, what's left is all the things that I'm talking about. And those things need to be dealt with. Okay. Some questions on education and spiritual growth. And then I think we're done. I think it's 3 questions. Okay, this is a question from London. What should a Baal Teshuvah learn first? Should one follow the same order recommended for children? In other words, Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud? Or does beginning learning Torah later in life mean that a different order is called for? Greater emphasis on practical halakha and Mikra. Great question. Great question. And the simple answer to that question, I'll unpack it, but the simple answer to that question is not the same as what we would give to a child, right? Absolutely not the same. The first thing is that when a person is older, and this is not just for Baalei Teshuvah, by the way, right? I mean, it could be that a person I mean, I guess it depends on what level of Baal Teshuvah you're talking about, but if a person was a practicing Jew, right? They were an observant Jew, but didn't learn a lot of Torah in their life when they were younger, you don't begin with Mikra. I don't think that it's a good tactic. I'm not saying they shouldn't learn Mikra, but it's not a great tactic. First of all, what ends up happening is you really do need to start bringing in the issue of en adam lomed ela b'makom shelibo hafetz, that there is a concept mentioned in the Talmud that a person only can learn in the place that their heart desires. So there is something about being interested in the subject matter. So if a person is going to start studying Torah, they should start studying in something that interests them. That's important. You don't just start, doing Mikra and Pisukim. You're not a 2-year-old, right? That's what you do for 2-year-olds. You don't do that for an adult. That's number one. Number two, um, it is true that they don't, if they are Baalei Teshuvah in the sense that, and then ultimately, I didn't finish that, but ultimately, once you get into Torah and you start learning things you're interested in and that you like, um, if they're serious about study, if they're serious about learning, they have to recognize that Torah or nor is any other learning in this world Sesame Street. Right? I mean, it's not always fun. It's not always exciting. Sometimes you really have to, just get through tedious material, and sometimes you really have to break your head in order to be able to understand something. And as Harambam says, you have to pray in order for Torah to actually manifest in your heart. Because when it comes to Torah, it's not purely academic. You're dealing with something that comes from Shammai, which is not of this world. And the way that you acquire it is through tefillah. Rambam writes it explicitly. So that's important, right? So once a person gets into it, the entry to Torah should be what interests you, but ultimately, if you're serious about study, you have to be prepared to actually engage in the study, even when it's not fun, even when it's not exciting, and study what needs to be studied. Ultimately, everybody needs to study Kol Torah. Right. So I always encourage and believe that people should study Mishneh Torah, should study Rambam, because that gives you not only an option if you study it in toto to really get through the entirety of Torah Shebaal Peh, and you can choose places in the Mishneh Torah, begin with places in the Mishneh Torah that you are interested in and like. But it also answers another practicality, and this is true. You recognize this. You said, should they focus on halakha? Yes, because if a Baal Teshuvah, and in the meaning of Baal Teshuvah is a person who was just not connected to observant life and didn't have any involvement in mitzvot, they have no idea what to do, which is not the case with a child who grew up, learning Mikra and so on. So you do need to learn halachot, right? You do need to learn what to do. And I would say, as an ancillary to this, a Baal Teshuvah really does need to spend time with observant Jewish people and be immersed in the contextual living of the things that they are studying, because a lot of times the study gets into a person's mind and they don't see the practical applications of it, and there's dissonance there. Right? So they need to be able to also live with people. But in all of that, Mikra is very important, right? So an element of their learning should include Torah, Nebi'im, Ketuvim. Okay, this is a question from Rafael Dayan in Deal, New Jersey. Hello, Rafael. When preparing to teach children about God and mitzvot, should instruction be deliberately sequenced according to stages of moral development? In other words, first obedience, then reward and consequence, then duty to the system, and finally intrinsic covenantal love. If so, how should the earlier stages be framed to remain true and not require demolition later? If not, what sequence and framing should be adopted? Yes, it should. Yes, it should be in that sequence, because for the simple reason that little children are not sophisticated enough to be able to understand covenantal love. So it's much more detrimental to bring that to them when they're not ready to absorb it and understand it. So yes, you begin simply telling them this is what you do. Why? Because Hashem said so. And that's it. That's no, there's no demolition that's required for that. Right? That is always true. No matter how old and intelligent you become, it's always true that you do this because HaKadosh Baruch Hu said so. Gezerata katubu. It's true that it can be broadened as the child grows. right? And the child could begin to understand the berid and the commitment of Hakadosh Baruch Hu and the love of Hakadosh Baruch Hu and then ultimately the love back towards Hakadosh Baruch Hu. That is all a question of just a building out of things, not a demolition of things. And finally, Jeff Sakal in Brooklyn. This, I believe, is the last question. I believe this is the last question. Yes, it is. Okay. And the question here from Jeff Sakal in Brooklyn is, what are your thoughts on breath work, meditation, and psychedelics? What a question to end on. To find deeper meaning or connection, especially since some say they can help with addictions and traumas. Well, that's another thing, isn't it? Um, my thoughts on any of those things are not specifically negative or positive. If they can help a person facilitate better life and behavior and better conscious awareness, then fine, as long as they are a means to an end. If they become the end, then we failed. All right. So if any of those things, if meditation itself becomes an end, it becomes the purpose of my life. This is what I dedicate myself to. If psychedelics becomes this is what I do for myself because I love psychedelics, we failed. Because the goal is always to know Hakadosh Baruch Hu. And the goal is always to live a life striving towards connection and relationship with and love with Hakadosh Baruch Hu. So if those things help quiet the mind, focus the mind, broaden the heart. Well, lovely, right? Those tools can be used. There's nothing wrong with using tools to be able to get to that space. I mean, everything ultimately is a tool. Yes, it's just that you have to get into that mind space. You have to get into that area. The fact that people say that these things can help with addictions and traumas, that's a different question, a slightly different question, because the addictions and traumas are very, very formidable obstacles to people for being able to know HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to have a relationship of any kind, much less with God. Addictions are profoundly obstructive. They essentially wrap a person around themselves psychologically, and they cannot get around themselves in addiction. And so there is no option for any real relationship when a person is addicted to anything, right? And I don't think that, and it's not just substance abuse, right? It's not substance abuse. It is any compulsive drive to behaviors of any kind. That's my definition of addiction. That's not the clinical definition. Because the psychology is the same. And it just wraps a person up around themselves, and it's a terrible problem. Traumas lock a person into a specific event or events that they cannot get around. So those need to be dealt with in order for them to be able to grow and to be able to develop and be able to build relationships and to relationships to themselves, relationships to others, and ultimately relationships to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So if those things can help unlock those things or loosen those things, by all means, but that is required. Okay, and with that, we end our November Q&A. I look forward to the next. Thank you very much, everyone, for taking the time to ask your questions. I hope that the answers that I've offered somewhat help to bring some kind of clarity to the issues, but always an ever evolving and developing discussion on all of these things. And it's always a challenge when you've got many, many questions, every single one of which practically can be its own lecture, its own discussion for another 90 minutes. But as usual, these are always, like I like to say, broad strokes. I wish everybody a wonderful winter and enjoy, and look forward to the next time. And thank you to everybody for coming on, and for everybody at the Chabura. Hashem Shmerechem V'Chayechem.
Thank you, Rav. Yom Tov.
Good night.
Good night.